What's going on, everybody? How's it going? My name is Nick,
I'm Adam.
and welcome to Conserving Catholicism after our long hiatus. We've had some shifts and changes in our living and where we're at right now. So it's been a little bit of an adjustment, but we're finally back and hopefully getting back into a schedule to record more videos for you. But just on the topic before we begin, Adam, do you want to just briefly say what's going on with yourself?
Yeah, so as Nick, you mentioned, I recently had a move. Now currently located in Steubenville, Ohio, which, as some of you may recall, we both Nick and I visited last fall. It was last October, I believe, and we have a video about that, kind of recapping our experience there, and ended up moving there. So that's where I've been for the last about month and a half. So that's what's new with me, Nick. I think where you're currently located is probably even more apropos to our today's topic.
Yeah, so I am currently in Rome at the moment for the semester, studying at the Angelicum with the Thomistic Institute. So it's been fun. It's been good. A lot of work, but I'm enjoying it. And hopefully in a few months, I'll be in Washington, D.C. With the Thomistic Institute. So that'll be another change of location, but hopefully the hiatus won't be as long for our next video. But for today, Adam, what are we talking about? What do we have?
Well, so I believe today we're kicking off a sort of mini series on Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways. And as we should, we're starting today with the first way, which is the argument from motion. That's all I have. If you want to just dive right into the argument. I don't know if you want to give any background on the Summa or where we can find this argument, Aquinas, more broadly.
Yeah. So the argument is the first argument is the argument from motion, and all the 5 ways are found in St. Thomas Aquinas' work, the Summa Theologiae, which is found in. Let's see. Last time I was thinking about it, I messed up. This is our second take on this. Our first take wasn't as great for you guys, so we'll see if this one makes it on YouTube. But so the 5 ways can be found in the prima pars of the Summa Theologiae, the first part, and it's in question 2, article 3 of the Summa Theologiae, and you'll find it in his respondio section. And so this is where he's listing his arguments for God's existence. And just before we get into the argument real quick, it's just important to keep in mind that for St. Thomas, he's written a lot about arguments for the existence of God. He has actually more than just these 5 ways, but for the purpose of this series, this is what we're going to go over. But these sections, as found in the Summa Theologiae, are just kind of recaps about some kind of arguments for theologians to listen to. As the title suggests, the Summa Theologiae is a summary of theology. So this is for introductory theology students who would have already had some extensive background in philosophy, would have been familiar with the works of Aristotle and Plato, Duns Scotus, people of that sort. And so they would understand a lot of the jargon that St. Thomas is using. So this is just kind of a recapitulation of some of these general arguments that St. Thomas has talked about in other works like the Summa Contra Gentiles, where he goes quite extensively into these 5 ways, much more extensively than he does in the Summa. So some people look at the arguments in the Summa and think, what, this is all he has, 1 paragraph for God, really, and that's supposed to prove it? And of course, we think that these are a good starting ground for our discussion, which is why we're doing a series on it. But if you want to look more at these arguments, St. Thomas does talk about it more extensively in the Summa Contra Gentiles in book 1, I believe. And
also his commentaries on Aristotle as well.
Yep, and his commentaries on Aristotle, commentaries on the metaphysics. You can find a lot of it there. So there's a lot of other places to look, but this series is kind of an introductory for some people who aren't familiar with the arguments at all, but also for those who want to get a little bit more involved in the argument, invested in the argument, some of the more intricate details and debates going on. We hope that we at least can point you to some other references that could be of use to you. Is there anything else that you wanted to add? All right.
So a fantastic introduction. So if you just want to dive right in, maybe just a word on how we're going to proceed through the argument. So Nick, you mentioned that we tried doing this the first time around, and one of the mistakes I think we made was trying to rewrite out the entire argument, which again is only a paragraph. It's not that long, and then to flip flop back and forth between exegesis and thesis, or explaining it and commentary on it, or making arguments in favor of some of the premises. We're going to try a different way this time. I think a little bit more structured and a little bit more manageable, where we'll break the argument up. I think we have it up separated into 5 distinct parts, flesh out some of the key premises, some things to keep in mind, clear up some misconceptions with each part, and progress through the argument there, and perhaps do kind of a recapitulation at the end, should we find ourselves wanting for a more holistic explanation of the argument. So I think with that, we can get into the first part of the argument.
Great. So this is what we've deemed to be the first main section of St. Thomas's argument. So as the Angelic Doctor writes, it is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion, whereas a thing moves in as much as it is an act. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. So off the bat, we have a lot of jargon that St. Thomas Aquinas throws out, but with very good reason, as we shall soon see. So just kind of to delve into what St. Thomas is saying, first, he's making a general observation of the world, that some things change. And so we see sometimes misunderstandings of this argument right off the bat here, where some people say all things change. And then as we shall soon see, that leads to problems. Well, if all things change, then why doesn't the first mover change as well? And so on and so forth. But as we see here, St. Thomas is just saying, making a general observation, some things are put in motion. And so motion, as he's describing it, as I've just said, is this kind of just an idea that things change, and it doesn't mean like I move from point A to point B. And one of the ways we can see this is in Aristotle and St. Thomas, they have 4 different kinds of change that they conceive of when they're talking about motion. So the first one's like a change in quality, something changing from being blue to white, change in quantity, something being from like weighing 10 pounds to weighing 15 pounds, or maybe changing in size, 5 inches to 10 inches. Is that change in quantity? You might see a change in position. So that's where my finger starts on this side of the screen and moves to this side of the screen. And that would be kind of what we think of as motion today, but what they would have called locomotion. And then there's also change in a substantial change, which is like something being generated or something being corrupted or completely destroyed. And so those are the 4 kinds of changes that they're thinking about when they discuss motion. So they're obviously just looking at that first. And then what you have is this language of potency and act that St. Thomas brings up. And this is probably the most easily misunderstood distinction, or some might see that it's not important at all. But the idea here is that St. Thomas is following Aristotle and describing when something changes, what does that change entail? And so Aristotle, just in brief, is responding to 2 pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus and Parmenides. The first philosopher, which says everything changes, and the second philosopher, Parmenides, says change doesn't exist and it's an illusion. And so, and they both have their good reasoning for thinking that way. And Aristotle tries to show, no, change does actually exist, but it's not everything is put in motion. And so he's trying to show essentially, how do you explain change? And the main question is, how do you get something from nothing? So one example about looking at this comes from Edward Fazer. In his book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, he talks about you have a hot cup of coffee, and then over time, the hot cup of coffee becomes cold. The question is, where does the coldness come from? It seems to come from nothing, but things don't come from nothing. Out of nothing, nothing comes. It's the phrase ex nihilo nihil fit, if I'm pronouncing it right. But the idea is great. So the idea is that the coldness comes from something. It doesn't come from nowhere. And the way we might describe it is that the hot cup of coffee is actually hot and it's potentially cold. And so the coldness, instead of coming from nothing, comes from the actual potentiality the coffee has to be cold. And so with this, Aquinas is just saying, okay, things change, and changes the reduction of something from actuality, potentiality. So when the coffee becomes cold, it's now goes from a state of potentially being cold to now actually being cold. And that's kind of the layman's way, I guess, of putting that. I know I went on a little bit of a tirade there explaining some of the background and whatnot, but is there anything you would like to add?
If one is to go on a tirade, it should be a Thomistic tirade. So that's quite all right. Very well. In particular, your examples serve to kind of illuminate the premises at hand. So I would just echo what you've said in kind of a more general form. First thing, addressing motion. Because all the argument for motion, this can often lead to a misunderstanding at the outset, like you said. Change in motion for our purposes and for most purposes can be synonymous. I believe the term is motus in Latin, and it actually, I think it's from its Greek derivation. Just again, it's not just locomotion. Like we think of motion as like throwing a ball down a hallway or a train moving. Of course, that is a representation of change. But as you said, there are three other types of change. So when we say change or motion, unless specified otherwise, they're pretty much synonymous. And I'm glad you hit on the Heraclitus and Parmenides and why this problem of change is a problem at all. It's something that we experience all the time. We don't really think about, and so it requires kind of an alteration of one's perspective on philosophical problems in general, like why does change need to be accounted for metaphysically? And I think this is most evident in Parmenides because he has these two broad metaphysical categories: there's being and there's non-being. And if something is that was once not, then it must have come from non-being. But that's clearly a contradiction, at least per Parmenides, because something cannot come from nothing. When the act potency distinction is, of course, Aristotle and then Thomas's response to this problem that Parmenides and others, such as Zeno, bring up. So I think it's good to contextualize the arguments both from Aristotle and from St. Thomas as to why this is a problem or why change is a problem at all. And just one more thing, I would definitely want to emphasize that the act potency distinction not only applies to material things like candles, cups of coffee, squirrels, solid metals, and the like, but to all existing things, both material and immaterial. We find this principle, I think, most clearly stated in the first of the 24 Thomistic theses that are promulgated by the Church in the 20th century. It reads as follows, quote, "Potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists is either a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles." So I just highlight this just to say that we should keep in mind that act and potency are metaphysical principles and therefore apply to all being, material and immaterial alike. So that's what I would say for the first part of the argument.
Yeah, that's great. I don't think I have anything to add. But if there, of course, throughout this whole thing, like I mentioned, we're giving a brief, introduction and recapitulation. We're probably in future videos, maybe go into more detail about some of the questions and debates within this subject. And you can do many videos on many of the finer details in this debate, which we will probably get into. But for the purpose of this video, we're trying to keep it brief. But of course, if there are things that you would like us to address as we continue, feel free to write down in the comment section, or if you follow us on Instagram, shoot us a message on there and let us know, and we'd be happy to address that for you guys. So with that said, I think we're good to move on to our second section of the argument. So after was previously said, so St. Thomas continues, "But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Thus, that which is actually hot as fire makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it." So, Adam, what's going on here?
So we've established first and foremost in the first section that change exists, or change occurs. And that change can be described, again, metaphysically as the reduction of potency to act. But as Thomas states, this can only happen from something that is already in a state of actuality itself. That is to say that potencies can't actualize themselves. So he gives the example, which is a good example, but it can get us into some trouble. I think if we focus too heavily on the fire and the wood, he says, that which is actually hot as fire, it makes wood, which is potentially hot. So we all agree that wood can catch fire. So we can say as a general principle that wood has the potential to become hot, or wood has the potential to come on fire or something. So we have the fire that's actual. We have the wood that is potentially hot. The fire is needed, is an actual thing that is needed to actualize the hotness of the wood. That's what he's saying there. So I guess to distill this part of the argument is to say that something cannot actualize itself. It needs to be actualized by another. And we'll flesh that out in the more comprehensively in the next part of the argument. But that's essentially what St. Thomas is saying here. So one could imagine an objection saying, well, surely we see examples all around us of things actualizing themselves. I mean, we see an animal we see a cat walking across the street, let's say, and it seems to be moving itself. It's actualizing itself. Why do we need something to be moved by another? I don't have to pick up the cat and take it, across the street. It can just do it itself. Nick, what say you to an objection of that sort? Does it succeed?
Yeah, so it is, I think it's one of the most difficult questions, I guess, for the Aristotelian, the Thomist who's defending this position. But when we dig deeper into it, we realize that it's not a form of self-actualization in the way that Aristotle or St. Thomas are discussing it. So if I move my hand, some might say, well, that's you just moved yourself. But the issue is we don't say that the hand qua hand, that is to say the hand as it is a hand, moved itself. We say that, well, the hand was moved by, let's say, this ligament over here and then moved by this muscle. I am not an anatomist. I'm not a biologist, or a neuroscientist. So my science is probably off here, but that is germane, I guess, to not totally, I guess, on part of the discussion. That's just to say that I might be wrong on some of these scientific principles, but the metaphysics still hold. So the hand is, let's say, moved because neurons at the rock bottom, neurons are fired from my brain, and they send signals to the hand. So essentially that there is something else, even on a materialist point of view. Let's say you deny immaterial things, but on a physical point of view, you would say, well, no, the hand's not moving itself. And we see that this principle is also laid out in just other things. Let's say if like an ice cube melts, it would, and someone says, well, why did it melt? It would be kind of strange to say, oh, well, because it's an ice cube. Well, if that were the case, then ice cubes would just be melting all the time. But they only melt in certain situations. Similarly, if my hand moved just because it was a hand, and say, well, hands in and of themselves, if I cut off my hand and just left my hand on the table, the hand's not going to move on itself. So it's moved by these other things. And of course, the Thomist, even the Aristotelian would say, well, what moves the body to do certain things most fundamentally is the soul. The soul is the principle of change, the principle of movement and power. So the soul is what actualizes the body, is kind of I guess the proper way to say it. It's so in this idea, matter is just pure potency, form is pure actuality. So as the forms conjoin to the matter, the matter, which doesn't have any actuality in of itself, becomes actual through this form. And so that gets into a little bit more of a technical discussion that is probably beyond the scope of this video. But all this is to say that the cat doesn't really move itself. Maybe its brain sends signals to its feet to then move the feet. And so that's, I think, one perfectly, I guess, legitimate critique prima facie. But when we inspect it a little bit more, we see that there are other issues with that critique. Another critique that's been made, to my assessment, not a very good one, but there is one from Rationality, YouTube channel Rationality Rules, Stephen Woodford. He makes a critique, which is, he says, well, we have a metal beam, and the metal beam, if it's hot on one end, let's say it's cold on the other, it eventually the cold end will become hot. And so he says, but the beam has now actualized itself. It's now become hot on its own. And then, so Adam, how do we how do we respond to something like that?
Quite simply by saying, how did the one part of the beam get hot in the first place? Right, because the causal event that he's claiming is a representation of self-actualization, namely the hot part of the beam going toward, making the entirety of the beam hot, or the cold part of the beam becoming hot, actually hot, if you want to frame it in terms of this discussion in particular. But of course, the beam would have to get hot at some point, prior to. That is to say, something had to actualize the hotness of one part of the beam. So as far as objections go, it really doesn't succeed, because it actually serves to represent why something must be actualized by another. So yeah, I think it's a pretty simple objection, or sorry, simple response to the objection.
Yeah, I think just that kind of objection. And if Rationality Rules has made an updated version of the argument, or has rejected it, then I apologize if I'm using an old argument on his behalf. But it does kind of, I think, really just miss the point of what's being said here, in the sense that, as you mentioned, the cold part is becoming hot. It's potentially hot and actually becomes hot because of the hot part of the beam. So it's not the beam qua beam. It's not the beam as the beam that makes itself hot. It's the hot end of the beam as the hot end that makes the cold end of the beam as the cold end hot. And so that's why we see that the cold end is not actualized by itself, but by the hotness of the other side, or vice versa, let's say. And so I think it's we can see here that this is just kind of an intuitive understanding. And anytime we describe some kind of change in the world, we say, oh, well, the ice melted. What melted it? I turned blue. It's like, okay, well, how did you turn blue? You turned blue from what? And so you go from a state of potentiality to actuality, but by something else. I can't become blue by myself, because if I did, and I just turned blue on my own, I'd be blue anytime I wanted to be. And it really helps us to understand why things change when they do, I would say. I don't know if you have anything more you wanted to address on that.
No, I think we can move on. I think we've articulated that point well.
Sweet. So section 3, St. Thomas writes, now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way, a thing should be both mover and moved, i.e., that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. So
this part of the argument, in my estimation, contains the key premise, namely, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. We kind of foreshadowed in the last portion of the argument. And here I would stress that for change to occur, we obviously need potentialities, because change is described itself as the reduction of potency to act. But a given potential is always a potential for some actualized state. In other words, it would be incoherent to talk of pure potentiality in contrast to pure actuality, which, as we will see in the forthcoming, is essentially the conclusion of the argument. But you can't have pure potentiality. It's an incoherent statement if we are to take potentiality as being potentials for something. So the underlying principle is that while potency is necessary for change, it is not sufficient for change. Actuality is both ontologically prior to and more fundamental than potentiality. And I would stress the first part of that last statement I just made, ontologically prior to, because I've heard it said, well, if potentialities are potentiality for a certain actuality, but and actuality has to be prior to, can only something be actualized? When it would seem that the potency is fundamentally prior to, and that's true in a temporal sense. That is to say, the beam is not hot; it is potentially hot, right? But some actuality to which that potentiality moves toward, namely hotness, from a fire or what have you, has to be in act before for that to be even a reality. Hope that makes sense, right? The actuality has to pre-exist ontologically, right, in order for something to move toward it in general. Because if it didn't exist prior to, right? Again, in a more fundamental sense, then it couldn't instantiate itself in the temporal sequence of events, because there would be nothing towards which it would move towards. You potential coldness, potential hotness as potential hotness wouldn't mean anything if there were no such thing as hotness. I guess that would be the way to summarize that in more layman's terms.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's right. And just bouncing off that, another way of thinking about this too is that if I said that this object can be heated up, but then could provide no example of something that had the power to heat things up, we would be confused as to what you mean by heating up. Like, how can it be heated up if there's nothing that can do it? And so in that sense, yeah, actuality is more fundamental, more prior to potentiality, because we can only understand the potencies in reference to what actually is. So I think that's a really good point. And I think another thing to stress here too is just this really relies also on the law of non-contradiction, that something can't be what it is and not be what it is at the same time and in the same respect. So you can't be actually hot and potentially hot. It would be, it's an awkward thing for us to say in our language today. If I said, yeah, I'm hot now, but I'm also not hot right now. It's like, well, which one is it? Are you hot right now or not hot right now? So it's a violation really of the law of non-contradiction, that something is and not is in the same way and in the same respect. And that's also an important part too, is to emphasize that. That part, it's not to say that something can't be and not be absolutely, but just that it can't be and not be in the same way, in the same respect. That's a key version there. So for example, we might say, like, one of the other problems that are brought up for self-actualization is if a sick doctor heals himself, they might say, well, he's now a self-mover. But the idea is that the doctor, insofar as he is a doctor, is the mover, and insofar as he is the sick patient, he is moved. So he's not a mover and the thing moved in the same way, in the same respect, but in different ways and in different respects. He's mover in the way that he's a doctor, but he's moved insofar as he's sick. And so we see that this distinction here is one that definitely needs to be kept in mind when we're talking about why things can't be and not be at the same time. And so that's why we see that crucial crux of the argument for St. Thomas as well, is that I can't be actually and potentially hot. And this leads us kind of to the next point that we're going to get into about this infinite regress, so to speak. So with that said, I think we're good to begin with the next section, right?
Absolutely.
All right. So St. Thomas continues, if that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there will be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only in as much as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. So what say you, Adam?
One of my favorite parts of the argument. So a couple of things to emphasize here. First, we need to highlight a crucial distinction about causality as it pertains to actualization, or as that pertains to change in general. And that is the difference between per accidens and per se causality. So what does this mean? Per accidens, otherwise referred to as linear causality, consists of a causal chain that is A, temporal, that is, it occurs over a given length of time, and B, non-derivative, that is, any given effect Y does not depend on the concurrent existence of its cause X in order for itself to exist or to exercise its own causal power. So the classic example of this is the begetting of children. So parents are the cause of the existence of the child, but the existence of the child, once begotten, is no longer ontologically dependent on the existence of his parents to exist or to beget children of his own once they reach maturity, of course. And it's kind of a morbid example, but if the child is 5 years old and the parents die in a car crash or something, it's not like the child will just disappear off. It's not ontologically dependent for the concurrent existence. So although the parents were the cause in a temporal sense, not a cause in a fundamental ontological sense, at least concurrently. So by contrast, per se causality, which is otherwise referred to as hierarchical causality, is my preferred term, at least, and this one Ed Fazer uses. That's where I got it from. Per se causality consists of causes that derive their existence from the concurrent actualization of some more fundamental cause. So the actualization of the cup being able to rest on my desk here is dependent on the existence of the desk, which is further dependent on the existence and integrity of the floor, which is dependent on the building's foundation, and so on. So were any of these more fundamental causes to disappear, the cup, and indeed any other less fundamental node in this chain, it would cease to be actualized. So I think we should note that hierarchical causal chains are not situated sequentially, but concurrently, right? They're not temporal, they're hierarchical. So another way to kind of formalize this is that at any time t, the less fundamental nodes, the cup, for instance, are dependent on the more fundamental nodes, such as the foundation of the building, at any given time. And this is precisely why, as we'll probably discuss in the next few moments, there cannot be an infinite regress of hierarchical causes, for without a first cause in the ontological sense, again, not in the temporal sense, there would, properly speaking, be no source of being at all. Hence, per Aristotle and Aquinas, we need a first mover, which is the conclusion of the argument. So I know I threw a lot out there, and you can tell my zeal is overtaking me, because this is one of my favorite parts of the argument and things to talk about. So hope that all made sense. If I need to clarify anything, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I think just breaking it down a little bit more, because I think that this is one of the, if not the most important part of the argument, at least the most misunderstood, I think, is that some people think that St. Thomas is arguing for a first mover in the sense that in a temporal sense, or in a per accidens chain, as you've mentioned. And so they kind of liken it to something like William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, saying, well, the universe had a beginning and therefore the universe had to have a cause. And so the idea is that no, St. Thomas is not saying that. In fact, St. Thomas didn't think that you can, through reason or through philosophy, thought that you couldn't argue for the beginning of the universe. He thought that that was something we can only know through divine revelation and through sacred scripture. So St. Thomas rejects that philosophically. You can say that the universe had a beginning. So he's basing this off of the universe being eternal. So the question is, okay, here and now, and why is it that certain things, as you mentioned, like your cup, is able to stand where it is? And that's because there are certain things that are causing it to be here and now standing up, not in a temporal sense of like when the cup was made or when the cup was placed down, but why is it at this moment in such a way that it is. So I think this difference between per se and per accidens causal series are really something that's important to keep in mind, because it's so easily misunderstood. So I think that's a good way of really a great explanation, the way you said it. I think one example too, and I think this is something that Edward Fazer brings up as well, that I really like to use to think about this, of why there needs to be kind of some first cause for certain things, or for certain per se causal series, is if you have a copy of a book and you say, okay, this book is a copy of this other book. And then I said, okay, now where's the copy that it's from? And you say, here, this is the copy of a copy. And I say, okay, but what's this a copy of? Oh, well, it's a copy of this copy. At some point, there needs to cease being just copies of books. There needs to be a first book. And because if there was no first book, then there would be no copy of that book, and there'd be no copy of that book, and so on and so forth. And so that's what St. Thomas is getting at. If we don't have this first mover here, that's why we wouldn't see, if we had no first cause, then there wouldn't be any effect from that cause, or third effect or fourth effect. So you wouldn't see the effect of the cup here if the thing that caused that effect were gone from the beginning, as opposed to, as I'm a child, if my parents died, I'm not going to disappear. I'm not going anywhere.
You continue to exist, but also you have causal power yourself. So that's why that non-derivative or non-instrumental is another way of phrasing it. If we view causal powers as instrument, whatever, you still have all else being held equal, the causal power to beget your own children, and so on ad infinitum. Which is why, in principle, at least per accidens chains can regress to infinity. Although that's still, as with any philosophical question, a matter of intense and very interesting, I think, debate.
Yeah, and I think we look no further than St. Thomas's own example, where the hand uses the staff to push the rock, the staff, as you've mentioned, has no causal power on its own. On its own, it can't push the rock. And so, as you mentioned, it's an instrumental cause. So insofar that it derives that power from something else, namely my hand. My hand is the first causal power, if you will, in this example, that pushes the staff, which pushes the rock. But as soon as my hand ceases to give the stick the power to push the rock will stop moving as well. And so it's definitely something important to keep in mind. I think one other question to consider here before we continue to the last little bit that St. Thomas has is something that's been brought up by other atheist and agnostic philosophers, and I think it's a pretty good on the surface, I think it's a pretty good question, and I think other philosophers like Joe Schmid have brought it up before. But the question is, okay, so let's say, all right, you're right, these causal series, they need to terminate in some first cause. I'm with you that this is exactly what changes the reduction of potency to actuality, that change needs to come from some other thing that is actual. It can't, there's no such thing as like a self mover in this sense. Something can't move itself. And that it needs to terminate in some first cause. But I might say, let's say I see a leaf changing from a green to orange. So that's one kind of change that I witnessed, a change of color. And then there's also a change of, let's say two parents have a child, they have a baby. So that's a change in generation. So those are two different kinds of changes that St. Thomas even regards as two different kinds of changes. Now, I think that both of them have to have a first mover. Why can't I say now that there are two first movers? Why does there have to be one first mover?
Okay, so there's two separate yet interrelated responses I'm going to give here. I'm going to introduce one that will be relatively simple to explain, and I may introduce the other one, although I won't go into detail. And if I start going into detail, stop me, because I want to do like a separate little project on this, specifically responding to one thing that Joe Schmid brings up in his really excellent video on the first way. It's more of a lecture really than anything else. So the first one is, if you're saying, okay, you accept that there has to be a per se causal chains have to terminate in a first mover, but why, we witness seemingly different types of change. Why does there have to ultimately resolve down to one first mover? I would say, well, say that there are two first movers. That is to say, I'll use Phaser's language here, purely unactualized actualizers. Right, that which actualizes everything else. It is pure act devoid of any potency. So let's say, okay, that's what the argument leads to. And let's say you accept the conclusion of the argument, at least insofar as there is at least one unactualized actualizer or one first mover. Let's say, why can't there be two or three or 50, right? One for the leaves, one for your children, one for the lamp, etc. So how would you distinguish between them? Right. And again, this gets into a broader metaphysical questions of describing things in terms of how they act and what they are and so on. But we'll just say, for the sake of simplicity and just by way of introduction, the problem first arises intuitively as to how you would distinguish between those two things. And the thing is, you couldn't, at least per the definition, that's the conclusion of the argument, namely an unmoved mover, or in more contemporary terms, an unactualized actualizer. To speak of multiple unactualized actualizers would be to speak of, in principle, or at least in theory, two things that have the same exact qualities, right? Namely pure act, devoid of potentiality. So if we're speaking of two things that are in principle, or by definition rather, the same exact thing, then how can we say those are two separate things, or three separate things, or 50 separate things? Wouldn't they just be the same thing? So that's kind of the intuitive response. I don't know if you had anything to add.
Yeah, no, I just briefly, the kind of in going along with the language that we've been using of potency and act, I think that hits the nail on the head, in which if you had two first actualizers, the idea is that they have nothing potential about them. They're purely act. But if that's the case, to distinguish them, let's say actualizer A has to have some quality X that distinguishes it from actualizer B, which has some quality Y. But if that's the case, then A has actually X, but potentially Y, and then B has actually Y, but potentially X. And so therefore now both of these things are mixtures of act and potency, of which there needs to be some further explanation of why they have it. So then they're not really the first actualizers if they're not pure act and they have some sort of potency that the other lacks.
Right. And I've heard it said as another kind of a similar objection, or maybe a corollary to the objection we're discussing now, as, okay, well, you're saying that there can only be one purely actual, or you're saying that unmoved mover can only be one, and you're arriving at that. And it's almost like you're begging the question, right? Saying that there only must be one. But of course, as you've just discussed, if we accept act potency, like that's where the argument leads to. It's not a presupposition of the argument itself, right? But we have the categories of act potency, how we conceptualize that, and how we, for lack of a better term, operationalize that in argument, right? And what we lead to is unmoved mover, unactualized actualizer, that is to say, pure act devoid of any potentiality. That's where the argument leads. So if one wants to reject the conclusion, then you'd have to turn to the premises.
Yeah.
You can't just insist that the conclusion is false and charge question begging when indeed that there really is no question begging.
Precisely. Yeah. No, and that's all I had. And you mentioned that there was a second kind of way of responding to this, and I'll try to make sure I keep you on time here.
No, honestly, I appreciate that. I'm going to refrain from mentioning it at all.
Okay.
Now, in the interest of time and the interest of everyone's interest. But stay tuned for something, because I either in writing or in a separate video, because it is something that I really like talking about.
We shall keep you all in suspense.
Yeah. Suspense it out. I'll allude to it by way of my running research question. That is probably going to sound incredibly obscure, and it probably is very obscure. So take it for what it is. But this is the question that surrounds the second objection that I alluded to earlier. To what extent can we speak of multiple per se chains without appealing to arbitrary termini? That's it. That's all I'm going to say about it.
Mic drop. Enough said. Yeah. If anybody asks you that question, you just use that line, and immediately it's game over. You've won. You just ask that question, and then it's all clear.
Exactly. It's just revelatory information. Yeah. So that's what that's my running research question surrounding how per accidens and per se interact and so on. Again, I'm not going to get into it, but yeah. Great. So that's all I have to say about the final part of the argument.
No, that's awesome. And like we said, we'll go into more detail in some of these finer arguments in later videos and in future episodes. But for now, it's also, we're trying to keep kind of an introductory measure, just for the sake of time, but also for the sake of people who just want to get a general grasp of the argument. And so that leads us to the fifth, really just a sentence. It's St. Thomas's tagline at the end. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. So, yeah, there are some people have some problems with this. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is very, very simple. It says, okay, let's just accept the argument just for the sake of argument. How do you get the God of classical theism, let alone the God of Christianity, as revealed in Scripture, from this argument? You just prove an unmoved mover, and the thing is, well, yeah, you're right. You don't get the God of classical theism or of Christianity. It's not really its point. Just in the same way as the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. Actually, I shouldn't even frame it that way. It's just the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't seek to, by itself, stand alone, prove the existence of God. It's simply to get to the Kalam argument is simply just to prove that the universe has a cause for its existence. And then further work is needed to then kind of draw out theistic attributes. So the objection, I mean, as far as the objection is concerned, it doesn't really serve as an objection as so much of like a clarifying point about what the argument is attempting to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it does it does get you to the God of classical theism, because the God of classical theism is one that
Yeah,
is
fair enough.
is
Yeah.
unmoved, unchanged, no, pure actuality. So I would make that point. It does get you the God of classical theism.
Or at least some of the classical attributes. I don't know if, I mean, I guess you can derive.
Yeah.
I know Phaser does that in his version of the argument. So I guess, yeah, it stands to reason that you could at least essentially derive classical theism from those arguments. So I stand corrected there.
But you are right, though, in saying that you don't get the God of Christianity. You don't, from here, you don't get the idea that Jesus came down, suffered, was crucified, died, and was buried, and rose again on the third day.
Yeah, you don't get the Nicene Creed from the first one.
Exactly. You don't get the Trinitarian doctrine, which is another interesting conversation to talk about with the Trinity and divine simplicity and classical theism, how those two are compatible, but that shall be for another day. But I think with that would conclude our video on the first way. If you guys enjoyed, please feel free to leave a like, subscribe for more content, leave a comment down below on what you want to see more of. This was a bit of a longer video because we had more jargon we had to sift through, but in the next 4 ways, particularly the next 2, they should probably go a little bit more quickly and a little bit more smoothly, considering we've got some of the philosophical terminology under our belt, at least most of it, that we'll see again in future videos. Any final send-offs or comments?
The only thing I have to say is, to what extent can we speak of multiple per se chains without appealing to arbitrary termini? That's all I have to say. No, in all seriousness, no, I think we covered most of the ground that we set out to. So I am satisfied.
Great. Well, that's it then. Mic drop. Goodbye.